Hi, everybody, and welcome back to Sword of Spirit, Sermonator, episode 78. Boy, that's incredible to even think about that. Listen, this week we're going to focus on two Psalms, okay? Psalm 18 and Psalm 19. They're very transformational with respect to the fact that David, who is the psalmist here, remarkable young fellow, filled with a lot of God's Spirit, in such a sense that he was able to see things from his perspective, God's perspective, hearing the voice of God, speaking of the Messiah, speaking of things to come, all within the verses of the psalm itself. Now, Psalm 18 is actually a rather long one. It's 50 verses. And Psalm 19, not so long. But they're totally complementary. And essentially what we talk about in Psalm 18, lo and behold, and we've seen this before when we did the issues with Psalm 75, 6, and 7 with regard to the rapture, the end time, and the final battles, that David was able to see these things and write about them in such remarkable fashion, such that we see a vision of the future in a prophetic sense in the wisdom books. Okay? They don't consider David a prophet. However, when you start to pull these things apart, like we always do, you begin to see patterns evolve and things that you know the same way John saw in Revelation. He saw things, and some of the things were not explainable in his language at the time. They're symbolic. But we're also going to talk a little bit about, there's a couple of idioms in the Psalms. And again, just to introduce the whole concept, next week, I told you it's going to be the fourth week. Next week, we'll, the following from this one, the next week, will be the week that we talk about the 43 idioms in Revelation. We go through them, give us a much clearer picture now that we have understanding of what's involved. We really need to understand it in the simple, plain language that Jesus and the apostles spoke in, which is Aramaic. So we're going to do that. Anyway, Psalm 18 is a psalm of thanksgiving for forgiveness and deliverance by God. And it's going to be very interesting in how we move through this. He says, I will love thee, O Lord, my strength. So right away, characterizes God as his strength. Now, right off the bat, he's fully in agreement with the Shema. Thou shalt worship the Lord with all your heart, your soul, and your might, or your strength. So he's saying that his spirit is in unison with God. All right? Remember, God said David was a man after his own heart, even though he failed. Remember, he is a man. All right? And that we're going to be subject to those things. And this was long before the deliverance of Messiah, but this is where the bloodline began, for the family line for the Messiah. So he right off the bat says, your spirit, that's my strength. The Lord is my rock, my fortress, my deliverer, my God, my strength. He says it again, all right? In whom I will trust. So how do you trust in the strength of God? Well, when you understand that strength is referring to the Spirit, the power of the Spirit, he says, I'll trust that. So by trusting that means he's righteous and in full agreement. Remember what David's name means. It means beloved. Okay? So we have it. He's trusting. He's my buckler and my horn, the horn rather, of my salvation. Okay? A horn, as we know, is the lead, like a king person in charge. So he's saying right here that God is my king. I'm in agreement with him. He's also my deliverer, my savior, okay? And he's saying this is also, all of this is under the Spirit of God's power. So what a mouthful. And then he goes on to say, he's the horn of my salvation and my high tower, okay? Which is like a fortress. All of these in one, basically full sentence, verse 2, Psalm 18. So this is a proclamation as well as a prophecy. To be delivered of God, to have the full strength of the power of the Spirit of God, to be a fortress, a buckler. Some of those things are war gear, things that we wear, warfare, like Ephesians 6:4. All right. He's the horn, he's the head, and he is my power. So there's a total commitment here. If you could say anything about what you would expect or want your relationship to be with God, it's right there. Okay. You come to verse 3, he says, I will call upon the Lord, who is worthy to be praised, and so shall I be saved from my enemies. Saved from mine enemies. Well, obviously King David had enemies. Messiah had enemies. The apostles had enemies. We have enemies. Anybody or anything that is against what you believe in the Messiah is in fact a spirit of Antichrist, is anti-Messiah. Okay? David makes this proclamation, makes it very clear to the reader. In verse 4 he says, the sorrows of death compassed me, and the floods of ungodly men made me afraid. The floods, what does that mean? That water damage? No, it doesn't mean that at all. All right. It means troubles. Floods or troubles, or the invasion of trouble and distress in my life, okay, from ungodly men made me afraid. So here we have an admission by King David, the great King David, who did not fear the giant Goliath. In fact, he killed him with a stone, a slingshot, basically, or, one of these jobbies. But because the sorrows of death compassed me, because of what these ungodly men did, put me in fear. Even after making a proclamation, all right, exactly about what God is, he continues to say why his now proclamation is, the sorrows of hell compassed me about, the snares of death prevented me. And in my distress, I called upon the Lord, cried unto God, and he heard my voice out of his temple, and my cry came before him even unto his ears. Okay? David said this, and he said it about himself. Wasn't it also the Messiah on that cross, that tree, that basically said the same thing? In my distress, ungodly men did this to me for no good reason. I called out, cried unto God, he heard me. And then the next verse clarifies why I think he's floating from himself to the Messiah. Then the earth shook and trembled, and the foundations of the hills moved and were shaken because he was wroth. Now, what happened when the Messiah called out, basically, my God, Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani, my God, why hast thou forsaken me? And he gave up the ghost. The earth shook. Remember, we said last week the temple was torn from top to bottom. There was thunder, lightning, and darkness at that moment. The earth shook. So while David is crying out in his own distress, he's crying out almost 900 years into the future, about 890 years to be exact. his own progeny. And when we go further, you'll see even more so. There went up a smoke out of his nostrils, fire out of his mouth, devoured, and coals were kindled by it. Now, he's speaking beyond the crucifixion to what we read in Revelation. He bowed the heavens. He came down, and darkness was under his feet. Where do we read about that? Well, it got dark for a while in Jerusalem at the crucifixion. But when he says darkness, total darkness, under his feet, that's Revelation. Listen, and he rode upon a cherub, and he did fly. He fly upon the wings of the wind. And listen, he made darkness his secret place. Another idiom, okay? He made darkness his secret place. And we look and see what that particular idiom means. In Psalm 18:11, it says, he is hidden from human eyes. He is hidden from human eyes. He made darkness his secret place. His pavilion round about him were dark waters and thick clouds of the skies. All right, this is exactly what we read in Revelation. So you see, David's time of worship took him into a place in the Spirit where he was able to see things and understand things that were immediate, that were to come, and that were to come at the end. In verse 12, we get right here. He says, at the brightness that was before him, his thick clouds passed, and hailstones and coals of fire. So if I needed to, I don't think I do, if I needed to point out a reference to Revelation, we just finished 2, and now we read the same things that we read in Revelation 16. Hailstones, darkness over the world. And it says the Lord also thundered in the heavens, and the highest gave his voice. Hailstones and coals of fire. Now, that didn't happen at crucifixion. It did not happen during David's lifetime. But the prophecy of what he saw is as I had said. So David is moving through different periods of time and epochs in history, prophetically, realistically, and in a spirit. This is powerful stuff. Why? Because even in the Hebrew Bible, they don't consider any of this prophetic. They consider it part of the wisdom literature. All right? But we're seeing differently here as we read it. In verse 14, he says, yea, he sent out his arrows and scattered them, and he shot out lightning and discomfited them once again, in keeping with what we've been reading. Then in verse 15 he says, then the channels of waters were seen, and the foundations of the world were discovered at thy rebuke, O Lord, at the blast of the breath of thy nostrils. He's now basically expressing his understanding for what he sees God is going to do. Okay? In 18, he sent from above, and he took me, he drew me out of many waters. That's what the word Moses means too. Out of many waters, out of the water. Okay? He delivered me from my strong enemy, and from them which hated me, for they were too strong for me. Now, who possibly could be too strong for King David? He beat Goliath. He avoided Saul's murderous treachery. The first king of Israel. Remember, Saul, the word means selected one or chosen one. David, however, means beloved. Okay? He was God's choice. But being a stiff-necked people, always crying and moaning, we need a king, we need a king, we want this, we want Saul, make him a king. God says, okay, fine. Careful what you ask for. So now, it says, he took me and he drew me out of many waters. What does that mean? out of many nations. The waters represent the nations of the world. He took me out of there. He delivered me from the enemy and from those that hated me because they were too strong. They prevented me in the day of my calamity, but the Lord was my stay. He brought me forth also into a large place, and he delivered me because he delighted in me. You think David's speaking about himself? He's not. He's speaking from the perspective of the Messiah and his experience. The deliverance from the enemies, okay? He pulled him out, brought him home, and brought him into a large place, delivered him. He delighted in Yeshua, delighted in him. Now, in verse 20, the Lord rewarded me according to my righteousness. According to the cleanness of my hands hath he recompensed me. This is clearly the Messiah speaking, because David certainly could not make that claim, nor could any other man. So he sees deep into the future the messianic promise of deliverance. It's all there. David recognizes it. He's a man after God's own heart. He sees it, and he's had the privilege to see it in a prophetic sense. Why? What were these psalms but praises to God? The Lord inhabits the praises of his people. Inhabits doesn't mean he lives for them. It says he means he lives in them. He lives in them. Those things, the tribute that we pay in gratitude, and it's not like you think, all crying and screaming hallelujah and everything like that. It's like anything else. When you care about somebody, you give them praise, okay? You let them know how valued they are. I've been blessed that way. I'll tell you, I have friends and family, people, that wherever I go, I always feel like they treat me like a prince. And realize, and people say, well, if you treat people that way, the good people will respond and treat you that way. And this is the communion, the relationship that we have with God, one-on-one. God is our parent, father, mother, sister, brother. He's our parent. That's what the word Abba means. All right? It's parent. He's all things because he's neither male nor female. He created man, male and female. God is spirit. But that spirit inhabits the joy that he feels. It's like when a little child reaches up to their mother or father. The feeling in a parent's heart is something that cannot be captured in words. Just can't. It's the same thing. People say, oh, God, this is some glory hound over there, just wants to be praised and worshiped. No, he wants to be treated with the respect of a parent for giving us everything, including the opportunity to come to that high place. All right? As he said, he took him to a big place. He flew on the wings of eagles. That's what it's about. But we see all of these things coming to pass. And we see that the Lord himself, David says, this is Yeshua saying, he rewarded me. Yeah, he did. He rewarded the Messiah. Messiah was a man. He rewarded him for his righteousness. He was in total righteousness, means in total agreement with God. According to the cleanness of my hands. He had no sin. Because of that, he was recompensed. So, here we are, 800 some odd years before Messiah is born, and David speaking of him. In that word sentence right there, he knew that he was righteous, and he knew that he would be sinless, because David sure as heck knew he wasn't. In verse 21, he says, for I have kept the ways of the Lord, and have not wickedly departed from my God. That's the Messiah speaking. David could not have said those words about himself or anybody else. I was upright before him, and I kept myself from mine iniquity. So he was without sin. Therefore hath the Lord recompensed me according to my righteousness, according to the cleanness of my hands in his eyesight. He repeats it. Then in verse 25, we change gears just a little bit. He says, with the merciful, thou wilt show thyself merciful. And with an upright man, you'll show thyself upright. Okay? Now he's speaking about David. He's speaking about himself, his hopes. He's basically saying, Lord, in your mercy, if I'm merciful, you'll be merciful. I know this. And if I'm upright, you'll be upright. This is David acknowledging what he needs to do to be in the company of God that way. And in verse 26, he says, with the pure thou wilt show thyself pure, and with the froward thou wilt show thyself froward. So what we're saying here is that God responds to us by virtue of who and what we are and what we do. If we approach him in purity, with pure heart, our prayers are heard, they're answered, because you cannot bring anything but purity before God's throne. It'll burn up, or it'll throw it out, all right? Or you'll get an answer you're not looking for. If you have clean hands, all right, if you're merciful, but if you're froward, all right, and untoward, then he'll be that to you as well. So you see, God is willing to respond and meet us where we are. But the result or the consequence of who or what or where we are, all right, the integrity of our character, the truth of whether or not it's God that's our rock and salvation, our strength and our horn, it's him who we lift our praises to. If it's anything other than that, then we can't fully be in agreement with God. We go our own way, and we wind up getting in some trouble. So he's going to say, look, if you're going to act this way, I'm going to act that way right back, because that's what you're asking me to do. In fact, that's what you're challenging me to do. And I'm not here for a challenge. I'm telling you, this is how it's going to be. And David recognized this. He recognized it in himself and in man in general. He says, because for thou wilt save the afflicted people, but will bring down the high looks. That's the proud. We know that pride goeth before a fall. We know this from Proverbs, right? And here it is restated. He'll save the afflicted, but he'll bring down the high looks, the proud, the arrogant, the stiff-necked. It's a balance. It's a one-for-one. Thing is that once we make the choice to be in God's hand, he says, I will let nothing separate you from the love of God. Nothing will take you out of my hand if we, in fact, put ourselves there in the right way. In verse 28, he says, for thou will light my candle. All right? The Lord my God will enlighten my darkness. Well, light my candle doesn't mean exactly light my candle. All right? What it means is that you'll give me heirs, sons, children. You'll light my candle. Give you light and happiness, and he will give me an heir. That's what it means in Aramaic. So now David is back to being David. He says, if I do these things, you're going to give me an heir. And that heir is the one that we spoke about before, the Messiah. All right? The Lord my God will enlighten my darkness. I am the way, the truth, the life, and I am the light of the world. That's the result of God lighting his candle. And in verse 29 it says, for by thee I have run through a troop, and by my God have I leaped over a wall. That means that all of the obstacles have been overcome by God himself and the faith that David had in God. In verse 30 it says, as for God, his way is perfect. The word of the Lord is tried, and he is a buckler to all those that trust in him. Buckler means a strength, okay, a foundation. He says the way of God is perfect, and the word of the Lord is tried. Well, we read last week where he was tried 3 times, all right, and found innocent each time. And he killed him anyway. For what? For no good cause. So yes, the word of the Lord is tried, but it's also proven. When God speaks, the word tried also means to be proven. Like in a trial, you're either proven guilty or innocent, okay? The word is tried. God will stand by his word if you believe in it. For who is God save the Lord? Nobody. Or who is a rock save our God? Nobody. It is God that girds me with strength and makes my way perfect. It is God who girdeth me with strength and makes my way perfect. The strength is in the truth, just like in Ephesians 6:4, we gird our loins with the truth. All right? Our loins are where the candle is lit. It's the focus of our humanity. And it's our basis, our strength. Okay? Verse 33, it says, he makes my feet like hinds' feet and sets me upon high places. Have you ever seen a hind walk and wall? You see these pictures of deer and antelope and sheep and stuff like that on high mountains. It's like, how did they get there? How do they move around? I don't know. But obviously it was apparent to David as a shepherd in the wilderness as he prayed and worshiped and wrote these psalms of praise to God in thanks and in every reason there is. When you spend this much time with God, believe me, he's going to talk to you. And I'm not saying you're going to get a book of Psalms or a book of Proverbs, but God's going to speak to you. You're going to make your way clear. And by doing that, what he's saying, he sets my feet and he set me on high. It brings me to a place like when we talked about the eagles that fly higher than any bird. They fly above the storm so that they can look down in it. In fact, the storm elevates them. They don't need energy at that point. The storm lifts them higher and higher. It's the same here. In 34 it says, he teaches my hands to war so that a bow of steel is broken by my arms. Again, the balance. Thou hast also given me the shield of thy salvation, and thy right hand holds me up, and thy gentleness has made me great. What a testimony from a king. You've given me everything that I need to do exactly what I need to do. The shield of salvation, again, a reference to Ephesians 6:4, with the armor of God. He says, your right hand holds me up. And we know that Yeshua is the son of the right hand, significant of the tribe of Benjamin, all right, which was the last stone on the high priest's ephod, meaning Benjamin means son of the right hand. Okay? So all of these things are in a great tradition of a long-standing, hundreds and hundreds of years in this process of the march toward the Messiah. Okay? He said, thou hast enlarged my steps unto me so that my feet didn't slip. And now he's back to being David, okay? Very clearly. He says, I've pursued my enemies and overtaken them. I didn't turn again until they were consumed. I've wounded them, and they were not able to rise. They are fallen under my feet. For thou hast girded me with strength unto the battle. Thou hast subdued under me those that rose up against me. So now he's back to being David. And because he's being David, we're going to get ready to take a short break, and we'll cut it there at the end of verse 39. But I think you're starting to see how this picture evolves and how God dealt with David in the spirit. Back in a minute.